Exactly the point, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Grania. Timothy, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks very much for coming along and providing your paper that we could consider before today. Your submission and indeed your oral evidence is very much focused on the UK state. Do you have any concerns about the ability of the legacy mechanisms to get to the truth behind terrorist murders? We've already heard from Brian that 90% of the murders were carried out by paramilitary organisations, whereas your paper and your oral evidence is very much fixated on the UK state.
Well, if you remember, the rationale that was given for the Legacy Act was precisely seeking to close down investigations against the state, and the Secretaries of State continuously said they wanted to halt those types of investigations, so that's the motivation behind it. In terms of your question, do we also have concerns in non-state actor cases? Yes. I mean, the issue with the ICRIR is that it has not been set up in a way whereby its framework requires it to conduct investigations that are thorough in the sense of Article 2 compliance, and that's across all cases. It has the ability to conduct light touch reviews, whereas if you constructed a body as per Stormont House, whereby there was an attempt within the legislation to build in obligations, that when an investigation met the threshold when a case met the threshold for reinvestigation, that it would have to be done in a manner that complied with all of the human rights obligations, and therefore would be a much more thorough fact-finding process.
Yeah, I think it is exactly that point. I think, the ICRIR doesn't provide anything to victims of armed groups. As Amnesty, we work with victims of both state and non-state actors. So if we return to the framework and the foundations of the Stormont House Agreement, the bodies that were proposed under it offer then answers and the opportunity for truth and accountability to those victims also. But we are absolutely concerned with victims of both state and non-state actors.
It's very easy to go after the state because there's paperwork, there's a history, whereas terrorists didn't keep files, they didn't keep paperwork, and it's easy to pick on one section, and that's a smaller section of the murders throughout the Troubles. Picking up on the term you used there, armed groups, when you refer to armed groups, are you talking about terrorist organisations?
Paramilitary organisations.
So do you use the term terrorist groups?
We use the term armed groups and paramilitary organisations. They're terms that we use.
So when you're dealing with looking at the IRA, the UDA, whoever, as paramilitary groups or armed groups instead of labelling them what they are, terrorist organisations?
I mean, you can label obviously how you see fit. We refer to armed groups and we refer to paramilitary organisations. That covers all of those organisations who obviously also committed atrocities during the Troubles, during the conflict.
Have you a problem with using the term terrorist organisations?
I mean, from our perspective, we use the term non-state actors as well. I think the difficulty with, and I know we're maybe sidetracking here from the core issues, but the difficulty with that term is we're opposed to all forms of violence. And terrorism tends to be an ideological concept that's used essentially to divide good violence from bad, rather than looking objectively at what each group has done, whether it's a human rights violation, whether it breaches the law. In terms of your assertion around paperwork, I would contest that. I mean, basically in relation to state cases, you can look at proportions and things like that. You obviously have to factor in cases which are state involvement due to collusion rather than the sort of 10% figure which is about direct state killings. You have to factor in the fact that a lot of those cases were precisely those that weren't investigated properly in the first place in terms of previous investigations. So, for example, if you take military killings in the early part of the conflict, there was over 200 people shot dead by the army. There were no convictions, there were no prosecutions, there weren't even any RUC investigations at all. So there's an investigative deficit there. In terms of paperwork, the experience is that the organisations didn't make a habit of documenting their own wrongdoing. Paperwork and files tends to refer to the investigation files precisely about Republicans, loyalists, non-state actors, etc. In terms of you are of course correct to assert that Republican and Loyalist groups didn't keep records and paperwork. But that's why you need a mechanism like the Historical Investigations Unit that was set up that would have been set up under the Stormont Out Agreement that had full police powers, because that's how you investigate those cases. They're not going to be done solely through archives, although a lot of the archival files will be investigation files that are precisely about those incidents. It was very, very rare that the state documented its own wrongdoing.
Sorry, Brian, I think Brian was...
Could I come in if Timothy agrees, just if it gives way? Can I ask you, I know we're talking about the whole framework and the context of this, but do you accept under Article 2 of the CHR that killings can be legitimate and lawful carried out by the state, and it allows for that in Article 2, where that is to prevent other killings, so that whilst around 10% were carried out by the state forces, many of those were lawful and legitimate.
In terms
and that is provided for in Article 2.
In terms of your first part of your question, is it provided for in Article 2? Yes, any form of legitimate self-defence by anyone to save the imminent life of another person. In terms of the assertion that the state killings largely fall into that category, we can't make a firm call on that until they've been properly investigated, which is why we need those mechanisms. Unless those incidences, you can't take the word of the people who did it, that it was lawful. They have to be independently investigated from those involved. But you're right, of course, there is
We assumed that they all were unlawful.
No, it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. You're correct. It shouldn't be assumed either way.
Because all terrorist and paramilitary killings were unlawful.
Yes. Yeah, by definition, armed groups operate outside of the law. However, in terms of state killings, until there's actually been an effective investigation, and this was one of the problems of the command paper that underpinned the Legacy Act, it asserted that the vast majority of killings by state actors were lawful. When we asked the Northern Ireland Office for what assessment they'd conducted to reach that conclusion, surprise, surprise, they didn't have one. It had just been put in the document. Okay. So until there's an investigation, you can't make that call.
Thank you, Timothy. Thank you, Chair.
I'm concerned with your language you would use around this. To me, a terrorist is a terrorist. And until we can get to that point, I think we're warm, fuzzy words we're using to try and mask what happened in Northern Ireland. Doesn't matter what side of the divide you came from, whether it be the IRA killings or the UDA killings, a terrorist was a terrorist. Final point I want to ask, have you done any work with the Republic of Ireland government regarding their role during the Troubles? Because they have harboured terrorists and protected terrorists throughout and provided a safe haven that they couldn't be extradited back to the UK. So can you just outline what work you've done?
Sure. In early September, just to give you the more recent work, we had a joint roundtable with our sister organisation in Dublin, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, to examine precisely this issue. And I mean, we've talked a lot today about Article 2 obligations on the UK. Of course, exactly the same obligations apply to the Irish government. We will be releasing a report shortly from that, which has examined the question of the Irish government's responsibilities to ensure that independent, effective investigations, including things relating to the Northern Ireland conflict, but beyond that as well, are also conducted in its jurisdiction. At present, there isn't an independent mechanism that can examine some of those cases, and one of the things I'd mentioned earlier on the International Panel on State Impunity that the University of Oslo had convened, one of their recommendations was for a sort of Stormont House Agreement Plus model that not only would have established the Stormont House, remember, had a number of institutions. One was the Historical Investigations Unit, independent police type unit that was only to operate in Northern Ireland. The second institution was the Independent Commission for Information Retrieval, which was actually cross-border, which would have examined, which would have been able to take protected statements in relation to incidents on both sides of the border. One of the recommendations of the international panel is that there should be, for want of a better term, an HIU for the South, as well as a mechanism within Northern Ireland to ensure that the same type of independent investigations that are being sought here are also conducted within the Irish government's jurisdiction. And I think there's a fair degree of unanimity around the non-governmental sector on that point.
Yeah, just to say that's also our position, and in terms of our engagement with the Irish government, I have led a delegation of victims to meet with the Irish government, including obviously victim of the IRA, and we also got over the I suppose the effects of the Troubles Act obviously on their case and what they want to see in terms of equivalent mechanisms in the South also. So those conversations are ongoing as well.
Any investigations in the south have to recognise that during 73 to 97, 110 extradition requests were lodged by the UK, and only 8 of them were successful. There was terrorists used the border to launch their murder and then either quickly disappear back across into the safe haven, or actually use the Republic, the land of the Republic, to murder people here in Northern Ireland. And any investigations in the future has to be very clear that the Irish government have a lot to answer for, how they allowed the terrorist campaign in Northern Ireland to progress and how they facilitated it.
I think it also goes back to a point that we've raised in our briefing paper and also just in our opening remarks around the need for there to be agreement with all parties, obviously, on a way forward. We've seen under the last government that unilateral action taken that departed from the Stormont House Agreement, that departed from an agreement with the Irish government, obviously, on this. There is a need now for this current UK government in the negotiations around the replacement legislation to engage, obviously, fully with the Irish government and for us to collectively reach agreement on those next steps. But as I say, we do have Stormont House Agreement a plus as a very solid foundation for that.
Okay, thank you. Just for bringing Emma, could you give us some figures? Obviously, you've given us some figures